Welcome back to yet another remastered episode of the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, your host. Of the remastered episodes I've done so far, this one will be one of the episodes where the content has been revised the most. So far, at least. We'll see as we go along. My understanding of the earliest church has developed and evolved throughout the years of creating the History of the Papacy. I would say this time period of the early church is really my favorite time period. Now, if you like these remastered episodes and really all of the podcast, I would very much appreciate if you left a rating and review at Apple Podcasts on your podcatcher app of choice. I would also very much appreciate it if you considered becoming a supporter of the show on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your financial contributions, as little as $1 a day, help immensely in keeping this whole operation going. Now, today in this episode, we will do a brief biographical sketch of Paul of Tarsus. We will look at how Paul fits into the story of the Roman papacy. Paul of Tarsus is a significant player in the development of what Christianity would eventually become. Paul of Tarsus and Peter, of Cephas fame, Peter the Rock, will be linked together throughout their entire careers. Just about anywhere you go, you'll find numerous churches dedicated to both Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul rate their own dedicated days on the saints' calendars and one combined. Peter and Paul will teach together, they will fight together, they will eat together, and they will definitely be in conflict together. Paul refined and developed the basis for the theology of Christianity. Paul's ideas gave the burgeoning Christianity a unique idea among all the other Second Temple sects of Judaism at that time, and these early Christians were really able to run with that. Now, this is a perfect point to stop and reflect a bit on remastering these episodes on the early church. When I set out to make this podcast, I really did think I would focus primarily on the biographies of the Pope and use the bios of the popes as a framework to add in interesting stories along the way. As I learned more and more about the early church and early Christianity, its development out of the historical Israelite religion, I became fascinated with the topic. Then, as I learned more about the idea of the bishop and how that role developed and the political history of early Christianity, I got fascinated with that too. In the end, I just felt you can't understand the history of the popes of Rome and the office of Pope of Rome, trademark, and how it developed without talking about all the other issues surrounding it. As I look back, it was this fourth episode of Paul of Tarsus, which I'm calling episode 1D now, where I think I figured all of this out. I also figured out that this podcast was going to be really more than just a history of the popes of Rome, but also a history of the Christian church. This podcast was always a voyage of discovery for me. Papal and church history is a huge topic. It is fairly much impossible for someone to know everything, and that's why I've made such a point to bring on experts, scholars, and academics of all stripe to talk about these topics. I've had scholars point out that something I said in an episode was an older way of approaching a topic, and that new evidence has changed how people in the field are viewing something. I've also had scholars point out that the new way of viewing a topic is not correct due to other evidence. All of this is why this podcast is a conversation and not a lecture series. So back to Paul. Christianity at the time of Paul could have remained a minority sect of Second Temple Judaism. It could have faded away and melded into one of the other more mainstream forms of Second Temple Judaism, or really probably any number of other possibilities. Now, in the originally published episode, I said, quote, Paul of Tarsus is the one who drew the clear lines between Judaism and Christianity. what Paul really did more than that was he started to fence in and define the doctrines of this particular sect of Second Temple Judaism around the belief that Jesus was the Messiah of the Old Testament. And he's making really big claims on Second Temple Judaism, and even going back into much older and antique forms of Judaism in the First Temple. This is all in light that Paul is described as an early persecutor of the Christian sect. I imagine Paul was possibly maybe more of an investigator of early Christianity. He was sent out to check and see what different groups believed. How much persecuting was actually going on in the first century CE by some sort of Jewish authority is kind of debatable, I guess. But investigations and this idea of investigating things was definitely happening. Based on sources, there were some even violent persecutions, but that's kind of later on and not at this early time. And there's just the evidence is really, it's thin to systematic persecutions. And I really don't think anyone can say that the type of persecutions that they said Paul was doing was really the norm. So really the objective today is to give some background on Paul of Tarsus in really broad strokes and then set the stage for the Council of Jerusalem. This is the first formal meeting of all of the most influential leaders and teachers of early Christianity. All the big names are there. But before we talk about this fairly monumental event on the road to the Roman papacy, we need to know a little more about Paul and how he fits into the situation. There are a number of fascinating characters who participated in this council, but Peter and Paul are central to the story of creating the Roman papacy. And that's why I want to set them up before we get into the Council of Jerusalem. Now, Paul was born in Tarsus in the southeastern section of modern-day Turkey. It's kind of right in that northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea. Tarsus was an ancient city that has an incredibly interesting history in and of itself, but that's for a story for a different day. Paul was born as Saul and claimed to be a member of the ancient Hebrew tribe of Benjamin. Some of his biography may have been massaged a bit to raise his Israelite Jewish bona fides. Importantly, Saul soon was to be known as Paul, was a Roman citizen. That connected him into the Roman world and Roman law. That will become very important later in his life. Paul was also importantly highly educated in both the Hellenistic and Jewish traditions. Paul was a part of the Jewish sect of the Pharisees, at least that's what we believe, and that's what the gospel accounts and the New Testament tell us. The Pharisees were among the many sects of Judaism at the time. They were a powerful force in Second Temple Judaism and were strong opponents of some of the other sects, including the early Christians. Although the early Christians and the Pharisees had a certain amount of theological overlap between them, it should also be said that the scholars aren't even sure what the actual divides were between the various sects of Second Temple Judaism, and that they maybe weren't as clear-cut as they are portrayed in the Gospels and other texts. With that caveat, we can say that the Pharisees would slowly evolve into modern rabbinical Judaism in the centuries after the fall of the Jerusalem temple. Paul began his career as a persecutor of Christians. He is said to have been present and possibly participated in the stoning of Stephen, one of the first 7 Hellenistic Second Temple Jews who became deacons and who Stephen was the first martyr of the Christian church. The stoning of Stephen may have helped Paul along on his road to becoming a Christian. Later, Paul hears Jesus speak to him on the Roman road to Damascus, and Paul became a follower because of that meeting with Jesus on the road. Pretty soon after that, Paul rose to the highest echelons of church leadership. He traveled all over the Eastern Mediterranean, preaching, teaching, writing letters to churches that were not following the Orthodox line. His his particular calling was to preach to the non-Jewish or Gentile converts to early Christianity. Paul preached a universal church where anyone could become a part of it without the necessity of following the Jewish law in its entirety. The degree to which non-Jewish converts would have to follow the law would be a major issue in the early church. The letters of Paul in the New Testament show a lot of tension between the two opposing camps. Can you really blame the earliest followers of Jesus for being a bit, circumspect, I guess you could say, about the new pagan converts? They believed that the new converts should follow the law completely. They saw themselves as observant Second Temple Jews because that is what they were. They were born and raised in the Israelite religion and culture. They were families that went as far back in the past as you could imagine as Jews or Israelites. It isn't an easy thought to completely change your mindset and worldview if you were an observant, traditional Second Temple Jew who thought Jesus was the Messiah. The law was a central part of their lives. The law was God's actual word to them and had to be followed as it always was and always would be. What Paul was saying was that Jesus' messages was for everyone. It was a Catholic message, meaning it was a universal message. And as a quick aside, we should probably get down to what is meant by these terms, Orthodox and Catholics. These are two terms that are thrown around a lot, and they have a lot of baggage, but we should get on the same page as to how we should define these terms and how they'll be used, especially during this early phase of the podcast. Today, we have the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches, but we also have the Roman Catholic Church. We should also say that the Pope is the leader of the Catholic or Roman Catholic Church, but both the Orthodox and the Catholic churches each would say that their own particular church is Orthodox and Catholic. So let's talk about what the Catholic and Orthodox means. First off, let's talk about Orthodox. Orthodox is derived from two Greek words, orthros meaning straight or correct. Think of your orthodontist or orthopedic surgeon. The orthodontist straightens your teeth. The orthopedist straightens your bones. A little side fun fact is that pedic doesn't mean bone in Greek. The term pedic is related to peda and pediatrician. Originally, orthopedists mainly worked with children. So there you go. But in short, ortho means straight, correct. And now a word from our sponsors. Now the dox part of Orthodox comes from a Greek word doxa or doxa, meaning teaching, belief, or something kind of close to that notion. We always hear the saying, translation is an art, not a science, and this is especially true with ancient languages. Works in ancient Greek had shades of meaning that were specific to their context. This happens in any language. Think of the simple four-letter word, fine, in English. Fine can mean something is especially nice, such as fine gold. Fine can mean something is minimally acceptable, such as, I want a large milkshake, but I guess a small is fine. If you don't take your garbage cans off the street for a month, you might get a fine, meaning an official reprimand from the government. Fine can mean pure, intricate, very thin. It can also be used as a verb as well. So you can see just pulling out your dictionary isn't going to get you to one glossary style meaning, like say gatto to cat. This idea of shades of meaning in a word is extremely important and will come up time and time again. When you put it all together, though, with orthros and doxa, you get orthodox, which means something like straight thinking, correct belief, or something to that effect. As you can see, that definition has a lot of room for interpretation. So with the term orthodox, we also get a related term, heterodox. Heterodox has the word heteros in it, which means another or different. Add that to doxa, and you get another or different teaching or belief or path or idea, thought, opinion, etc., etc. Heterodoxy didn't quite carry the baggage that the term evolved from a term that evolved from it. Heresy does. Heresy is much closer to an antonym to orthodoxy than heterodoxy is. Now we get to the Catholic part. Catholic is derived from a Greek word for universal. So if the church is Catholic and Orthodox, it is both correct in its teaching and universal, or covers all people. Paul is largely responsible for developing the Orthodox positions of the early church, or the idea that Christianity would be Catholic or open to anyone who wants to join in, especially Gentiles. Sometimes the word Jew and Greek can be used. Greek was a term for anyone who is not Jewish. Jew is obviously a term for anyone who was Jewish. If you were a Roman, Briton, or Chinese, you were Greek. Many of Paul's letters deal with the fact that Jesus died for everyone's sins. He wasn't just the Messiah or the Mashiach of the covenant of Israel, of a one specific people in one specific place. Jesus was the universal Messiah for all of humanity. And that's a pretty bold view, especially in the religious mindset of the day for either Jewish or pagan followers. We know from the letters of Paul and other sources that other sects of Second Temple Judaism also allowed non-Jews to become Jews. And that's a controversial subject, and the terms of how they could become a Jew was also controversial in the day. To me, the best way to describe how Paul fits into the story of the history of the Roman papacy is to say that he was primarily responsible for developing what would be the official teaching of the church. He founded few communities himself, unlike Peter and some of the other 12 apostles who founded communities of followers all over the ancient world, from Britain to India. I think of Paul as the professional that an innovative startup needs to bring in after the original startup has met with some success. Peter founded the early Christian communities in Antioch and Rome, among others, along with he was Jesus' right-hand man, but he really didn't have the training or the organizational expertise to take the movement to the next level. From every bit of evidence we have, Peter and many of the other original apostles were tradesmen with very little formal education. Paul, on the other hand, was highly educated, and his profession was theology. Paul had the high-powered education, training, and the organizational skills to bring the early church movement beyond the stage of a sect among many sects of Second Temple Judaism. In many cases, Peter caused problems and confusions, as we will see in the episode coming up on the Apostolic Council. From my readings and research, I get the sense that Peter was probably over his head with doctrine and organization. He was good at getting the word out and getting people interested and excited, what you might call retail politics or relationship building. As we will see with some of Peter's actions, they cause conflict. Paul will be the champion of the universal church in which anyone can take part, and on the other side of that debate was James the Just, or as he's also sometimes known as, James the brother of Jesus, who believed that followers of Jesus must accept the Jewish law in its entirety in terms of what someone like Paul would call the Old Covenant. Paul did not believe Gentiles had to, what you could say in essence, become Jews in the cultural sense. This would turn out to be a pretty interesting conflict in the early church. There's a lot to unpack with James, the brother of Jesus, or James the Just, as he's sometimes called. And we'll talk much more about this particular James in upcoming podcasts. He often doesn't get the attention of like some of the other bigger names. He was a major player in the early church, though. James the Just was a leader or bishop of the church in Jerusalem, and in that role, most viewed him as the successor to Jesus himself. He had a strong following among the Jewish Christians and even amongst non-Christian Jews who held him in high regard, giving him that title, James the Just One. Paul is famous for writing his many letters to Christian communities around the Roman world. He wrote letters to communities in Rome, Corinth, and Greece, cities in Asia Minor. These letters outlined major aspects of theology and philosophy in the movement. A great deal of Paul's letters were responses to the needs of particular communities. A local community would have some sort of problem. They'd write Paul, and Paul would respond. Think about it. These early Christian communities were having so many problems within as short as a decade of time after the time of Jesus. Some scholars believe that Paul's letters have a flavor of Gnosticism to them. Gnosticism was a very important movement in the early church and outside of the church, such as in religions of Zoroastrianism and Judaism. Gnosticism, in short, is a set of beliefs that, at its very basic beliefs, that there is a secret knowledge and that the world is divided into strict good and evil. The Gnostics believed that they had a secret knowledge, or a gnosis in Greek, that they could pass on to those who were ready to receive that secret knowledge. I'd argue that the Gnostics had some influence on the early development of Christianity, but kind of indirect and through a lot of different avenues. But in subsequent centuries, the movement of Gnosticism in its own right really wouldn't win out as the orthodox position, even though different incarnations of Gnosticism would develop independently throughout church history. There has been a recent resurgence of interest in Gnosticism with the discovery of the Gnostic Bibles, such as the Gospel of Judas and the now debunked parchment fragment that said Jesus was married. If you're interested to learn more about the Gnostics, I would suggest you listen to some of the episodes I've done on Gnosticism, and particularly the episode on the Gospel of Jesus' wife fragment. Paul got arrested in Jerusalem. He was accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple, therefore defiling the temple. Defiling the temple of Jerusalem was no small crime. Under normal circumstances, he would have just been flogged and crucified or some other similar punishment. But Paul had an ace up his sleeves. He was a Roman citizen, and as a Roman citizen could not be subjected to such punishments, especially by local authorities, non-Roman officials. A Roman citizen couldn't be crucified as a capital punishment. It was one of their civil rights, so to speak. Actually, the Romans had a lot of rights, such as that, even things such as capital punishment for a Roman citizen was actually quite rare. A Roman citizen also had the civil right to appeal their case directly to the Roman authorities and even directly to the emperor. That is what Paul did. He appealed to the Roman authorities, and the story goes that he was transported back to Rome by ship. He had a number of adventures along the way. His ship was wrecked at Malta. He spent some time there, and just many, many other adventures. But more to the point, Paul finally made it to Rome. This was in the 60s-ish AD. He lived in Rome for a time under a sort of house arrest. He continued to write, evangelize, and work with the local Christian community. He had a pretty easy time of it initially while in Rome. The Roman officials really didn't care about his crimes, and they didn't think there was much to the charges anyways. Later, more than likely because of the persecution of religious minorities under Nero, he was moved to the Mamertine prison in Rome, where it was significantly less comfortable than his own home arrest. The Mamertine prison is a pretty incredible place. This Mamertine prison, or the Carcere, is basically a hole in the wall where prisoners were usually not kept for a very long time. There's a ton of other famous inmates who were at the Mamertine prison throughout the centuries. One was Vercingetorix. He spent some time there whiling away before Julius Caesar had his triumph and then executed him. Interestingly enough, Paul and Peter were probably in prison there together for a time. Both Peter and Paul were caught up in the persecution of minority communities after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. As mentioned in the previous podcast on Peter, it is not certain and probably not likely that the Christians were the main focus of those persecutions. It's far more likely that religious and other minorities who were easy to shift the blame to were all caught up. I say religious minority persecution because it's likely Nero tried to pass the buck on the fire to as many different communities as he could. It's difficult to say that he just persecuted Christians because at this earliest time, we're only talking about 30 years after the death of Jesus. Nobody, especially Romans, would have been able to tell the difference between any other Second Temple Jew and a Christian. They were, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from each other from an outsider perspective. We can't be sure of any direct numbers, but there were almost only a few dozen of what you could call Christians in Rome at that time, and probably a significantly large number of Jews, Second Temple Jews. But like I said, it just was very difficult to strictly define those groups. Now, to wrap up Paul's story, Paul was eventually beheaded, which was a form of capital punishment suitable for Roman citizens. Some sources have it that both Peter and Paul were executed on the same day, although in different locations and different methods as well, somewhere around this year of 65 AD or so, give or take. Now, the basic point of this episode is that even though Paul wasn't a pope and didn't really have much to do with the founding of the bishopric of Rome, he was arguably the most important force in the development of the theology of early Christianity. As the years would follow, the religious movement would evolve, but it would be built on the foundation that was laid down by Paul of Tarsus. The idea of a universal church became a central point of the Christian movement, and the Pope would become one of the most central figures in that centralized movement. So far, we've looked at bishops, Peter and Paul, and next we will look at a really critical turning point in early Christianity, the Apostolic Council or Council of Jerusalem. This first church council would set the precedent of decision makers meeting in councils to solve problems, as well as serve to bring together the major personalities and issues of the earliest church. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will talk to you next time on the history of the papacy and the history of the papacy remastered.